No, not the originals I showed you. No.
Hello. Welcome to the first event for 2024 of the Newcastle Institute. My name is Robert Logan, and I'd like to start by saying that Newcastle has been a place of learning, a place of discussion, a place of sharing of ideas for thousands of years. And I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the Awabakal and Warramai peoples. And I would also like to extend my thanks to include all those who continue to make Newcastle a place of learning, a place of discovery and sharing of ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of being. Welcome to all of you here, and also to those who may be joining us right across Australia and beyond. The Newcastle Institute was established in 2004 as an independent organisation aiming to stimulate informed, thoughtful and rational discussion of public issues. The Institute does not take a position on any issue, but encourages constructive engagement of the community in the discussion of diverse ideas that are of importance to us all. We do, however, have some fundamental principles that guide us. These include respectful and rational discussion. We object to the tabloid approach where the loudest voice gets the most attention, and we ask that we all seek to follow that famous dictum of Francis of Assisi: seek first to understand, and then to be understood. World War I was described as at the time as the war to end all wars, but of course that ideal did not last very long. Over the last 100 years alone, we have seen the atrocities of the Holocaust, the murder of 60 million people in Stalin's Russia, the genocide in Rwanda, the killing and mass murder in Cambodia, the tragedy of the Balkans, Ukraine, and countless other atrocities throughout the world against humanity. And now we've all been shocked at the events of October 7th and heartbroken at the unfolding and gut-wrenching situation in Gaza. A strip of land that is about the same size as here to Port Stephens and 7 kilometres wide, with about 2 million people in that small area. But remarkably, one of the highest literacy rates in the world, but sadly, one of the highest unemployment rates. Gaza, a strip of land bordered by both Egypt and Israel that came about following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and some of you may have seen the destruction of the painting of Lord Balfour because of what was then. He was the British Foreign Secretary and what was known as the Balfour Declaration. But tonight is not really about Gaza. It's really about all of us. It is about you. About our collective responsibility as part of humanity. About how our identity can be quite different to our ideology. About how the media portrays and polarises issues to the detriment of us all. How they try to force us to take sides. The situation in Gaza, for all the tragedy that it is, brings these issues into sharp focus. There are those within our community here in Newcastle that suffered abuse, where swastikas and "Kill the Jews" have been painted on their home here in our community. For that, as part of this community, as a member of our collective humanity, we are ashamed and deeply sorry. It is a stain upon us all. I ask you, as a member of that collective humanity, to be respectful tonight. I know that the panel undoubtedly will have different views to many of us, as it should be. They will have different views to you. They will have different views to me. That is healthy. There will be a time for audience Q&A, and I look forward to your engagement with that. The facilitator for tonight's panel is Daz Chandler. Daz Chandler is a creative producer and interdisciplinary storyteller with a background in documentary filmmaking, broadcast journalism and media, along with human rights advocacy. Daz is the founder of The Parallel Effect, a collective whose creative interventions reimagine alternatives to the present we are living. Before I hand over to Daz, who will introduce the panel, I'd just like to read a poem. When I look at the images that come onto my television of dead children and others, the tragedy I see in my own land, I grieve for all those who have lost and suffered more than I can imagine. I think of this poem by the 17th century English poet John Donne. No man is an island, entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or thine own friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Would you please welcome Daz Chandler.
Hello. Thank you so much for the introduction, Rob, and thank you to the Newcastle Institute for entrusting me with this very important event. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on what always was and always will be sovereign Aboriginal land. I honour the elders past and present today and every day, and I'd like to extend a very special welcome, along with my commitment to the struggle for treaty and truth-telling, to any First Peoples sharing space with us this evening. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. Jewish Identities and Political Ideologies. This is a timely and important event that strives to clearly delineate and articulate Jewishness from adjacent political projects. Educational events like this that provide platforms to those whose lived experiences and insights are often sidelined from mainstream conversations about Israeli policy are increasingly important. Just a couple of days ago, a film based on the story of real-life Auschwitz commander Rudolf Höss called The Zone of Interest won Best International Feature Film at the Academy Awards. In his acceptance speech, director Jonathan Glazer, who is Jewish, explained that he resented his Jewish identity and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people, whether the victims of October 7 in Israel or the ongoing attacks in Gaza. Shortly thereafter, this Jewish director was utterly slammed all over social media. He was described as a person with moral rot in his soul he was cast as one of Judaism's historical villains by another and labelled a capo, the term given to Jewish inmates who were forced by the Nazis to serve as stand-in guards, blurring the lines between collaborator, perpetrator, and victim. Perhaps another perspective is that he was reclaiming his culture from those that argue that Judaism and Zionism are one and the same, that a religion and culture that is 5,500 years old does not exist as the support system for a 76-year-old colonial ethno-state. But we are living in times when Jewish identity and the memory of the Holocaust have been weaponized to support the Israeli occupation of Palestine, including the current conflict. And although differences of opinion between Jews are widening here in Australia as a result of so-called Jewish representative organisations, which have for a long time been explicit lobby groups for Israel, you'd be forgiven for thinking that all Jews here agree and support Israeli policy. Tonight, when we talk about Jewish identity, we are describing the 5,500-year-old culture and faith. And when we talk about political ideology, we are referring to the concept of Zionism and the way it has manifested in the Jewish homeland of Israel. So, what is Zionism? Now clearly, because of the nature of this event, we don't have considerable amounts of time at our disposal to explain the intricacies of this history and movement in depth. But before we get into our panel discussion, I believe it's important that you understand that Zionism is a secular political movement which started in the 1800s in Eastern Europe as a response to European antisemitism. To understand Zionism, you must first understand the widespread and vicious nature of antisemitism. Antisemitism, which has persisted for more than 2,000 years. In the first millennium of the Christian era, European Christian leaders believed that Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. This teaching provided the grounds upon which a superstructure of hatred was built. Theological antisemitism reached its height in the Middle Ages, and among the many myths about Jews that took hold in this period were the beliefs that Jews used the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes, and that their failure to convert to Christianity was a sign of service to the Antichrist. Jews even became scapegoats for natural catastrophes. Many parishioners believed that it was the Jews that brought on the Black Death Plague, responsible for killing millions of people in Europe in the 14th century. Murderous riots known as pogroms, launched against Jews by local residents, were commonplace, and they were frequently encouraged by the authorities. In the 19th century, 90% of the world's Jewish population lived in Europe. Theodor Herzl, who's said to be the founding father or prophet of political Zionism, was at one time a supporter of the assimilation and emancipation of the Jewish people. But after yet another series of vicious and deadly anti-Semitic attacks across Europe, he changed his mind, believing instead that the only solution for safety and survival was for the Jews to leave the diaspora and acquire a territory over which they would exercise their own sovereignty. And it wasn't until the First Zionist Congress in 1897 that Palestine was named as the destination for the Jewish national homeland. Prior to this, different Zionist thinkers had pointed to other destinations for the Jewish state, like the US Midwest and Madagascar, for example. When it came to Palestine, Herzl was aware of the existing population, but didn't perceive them as a collective people, and in a rather patronising and colonial way, which was typical of white supremacy and imperialist thinking of the time, Herzl believed that the Palestinians would, as individuals, embrace the Jewish state, that they would recognise that they would benefit from the economic booms and Western-educated ideals that the Jewish population would bring. Later, the Russian-born biochemist and fellow Zionist, Chaim Weizmann, worked tirelessly to get the Brits on board. He argued that the establishment of a Jewish state would be favourable to Britain because it would provide a friendly nation in a region of great strategic importance. Similarly to Herzl, Weizmann and the dominant political powers of the time upheld the ideals of white supremacy and of European imperialism by not recognising the collective sovereignty and self-determination of the indigenous Palestinian Arab population. It's also important to note that anti-Semitism was still prevalent at that time in the United States, in continental Europe and Britain, and hence those nations also welcomed the idea of a Jewish homeland because they didn't want to have to accept any additional numbers of Jewish refugees themselves. So with that, I'd like to finally introduce our incredible panel of Jewish thinkers, who in different ways are reclaiming their culture from those who argue that Judaism and Zionism are one and the same. It gives me great pleasure, first of all, to introduce Ronit Lenton, born in Haifa. I'm sorry, hold your, okay. I was just going to say hold your applause until I finish the bio, if you don't mind. Born in Haifa in 1944 in what was then known as Mandatory Palestine, Ronit is a political sociologist who was an associate professor of sociology at Trinity College in Dublin until her retirement in 2014. She's published extensively on Palestine, on Israel, racism, on immigration in Ireland, on gender, on genocide, and the Holocaust. Please join me in welcoming Ronit Lenton.
Just to say in Hebrew, Erev Tov, v'todah shebatem. Good evening and thank you for coming.
Next, I'd like to introduce Michelle Birkin, who is a former secondary school teacher working mainly with children with behavioural and learning difficulties and a mosaic artist. Raised in Australia, Michelle grew up in a religious Jewish household, complete with Shabbat dinners and a kosher diet. As a child, she attended the Kingsford Maroubra Hebrew congregation and the Great Synagogue Youth Group. Michelle was observant for a period, spent time in Israel, learned Hebrew, and was a liberal Zionist up until 2014, at which time she became a member of Jews Against the Occupation. Would you please make Michelle feel very welcome?
Thank you very much.
And lastly, I'd like to introduce Peter Slezak. Peter is a self-described secular atheist, assimilated non-Zionist Jew. Try saying that 5 times fast. Both his parents survived the Holocaust. Against the odds, his mother and grandmother survived Auschwitz together. Professionally, he is an Honourable Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of New South Wales. Please join me in giving Peter Slezak a warm round of applause. So I'm going to start with Ronit. Ronit, you have an incredibly unique perspective to share with us tonight as someone who, sorry, I'm going to take this out if I can. Okay. Now I can actually make eye contact with you. You have an incredibly unique perspective to share with us tonight as someone who was born in mandatory Palestine, ahead of the Nakba and ahead of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Now we know, as a result of the work of Israeli historians, as a result of the diaries kept by certain commanders and officers of various Zionist militia groups, and of course, as a result of Palestinian eyewitness testimonies, that in the creation of the Jewish state, 530 villages were destroyed, more than 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes, becoming refugees, and also that approximately 13,000 Palestinians were killed in that process. I'm interested to get a sense of what the Zionist narrative was at that time and how those events were framed and understood by the first generations living in the Jewish homeland.
Yes, I was born, as you say, in 1944, the end of the Second World War. My people came from northern Romania, and my mother's family came as refugees really in the last few moments it was possible to leave, but becoming colonizers. My father had come earlier. He was part of the fighting force in my hometown of Haifa, where they supposedly liberated Haifa from the Palestinians. In fact, I've written about my father's putative role because he never spoke about what they actually did. And when we were growing up, we grew up in a total belief that what we did was absolutely necessary and correct. We grew up with two main narratives. The first one was Jews were always the eternal victims. After all, did we have the Holocaust behind us? But even before the Holocaust, Jews were always persecuted, and we were just brought up to believe that the whole world was against us. But at the same time, and not absurdly, we also were brought up to believe that we are a superior race to others. We grew up with the notion of white European Jewish supremacy, which favored Ashkenazi European Jews over the Palestinians, but also over Arab Jews and Jews from North African countries. So basically, this notion of racial white supremacy was inculcated into us together with the notion of victimhood. And we see it even now as the Gaza genocide is raging, yet Israelis are feeling very much the victims of Palestinian aggression, even though the Palestinian attack of 7th of October was, as I see it, a reaction to Zionist colonization, not just occupation of Palestine. Zionists were colonizers, whether we like it or not. They were part of the European colonial movement, and they were not like other colonists who only wanted to derive wealth and riches from the colonized country. In fact, there were settler colonials who, like the Australian anthropologist Patrick Wolf said, aimed to eliminate the native population. And this they've set out to do from the very beginning, from the end of the 19th century to this day, by purchasing lands, stealing lands, and getting as many Palestinian lands with a few Palestinians as possible from the very start. And we can go into detail, but there's quite a lot of good scholarship on that, and you can read it for yourself, particularly in the more very accessible work of the Israeli historian Ilan Pape, who explains very clearly how it was done, planned, and executed.
So Zionists believe that a Jewish homeland is essential for the safety and the survival of the Jewish people, and that anti-Semitism is an ongoing threat that won't go away. What do you think it is that Israel does to make its citizens feel safe?
Well, actually, it's absurd to talk about safety of Jews in Israel, which is the place where Jews are the least safe in the world, in fact. I'm not suggesting antisemitism has been eradicated, like other forms of racism, and particularly Islamophobia, anti-indigenous racism, anti-migrant racism. It still exists. But basically, by promising us, we were called by parents the first generation to redemption in the land that supposedly the God has promised our people. Basically, this is a place, despite of what we were told, that we were not safe. Every Jewish person has to go to the army. I was very lucky, in fact, because I'd asked mine. I wasn't taken to the army, and for that I thank the state of Israel very, very much. But in fact, if you look at the level of Jewish death over the years by many of the wars that were in fact inflicted and initiated by Israel, it's not a safe place, despite the rhetoric of our leaders who keep saying to us that only by being the new Jew, the active, fighting Jew, as opposed to her, diasporic, degenerate, passive, weak Jew, only there can we be safe, because we're not safe there. And the more we attack the Palestinians, the more this genocide continues, the less safe are Jews in the state of Israel.
I was also just curious what your thoughts were. I mean, currently there are demonstrations happening in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, Israeli communities demonstrating for the release of the hostages. And I understand that not much is happening in that regard from their political representatives. Surely that also speaks to this situation around safety.
Yes. In fact, in the 7th of October attack by Hamas and other Islamic resistance organizations, they took hostages in order to ascertain the release of Palestinian prisoners within Israel. At the moment, there are something like 7,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jail. Many of them children, many of them are administrative detainees who have had no trial, nor did they get any indictments leveled against them. And these people kidnapped by Hamas on the 7th of October, there's about, I think, what is left, about 130 of them, are not being released, despite the approaches both by Hamas and by its allies to the Israelis to broker a deal according to which these hostages would be released in return for the release of Palestinian prisoners. And in fact, it's very clear that the government of Israel is not really interested in brokering such a deal. In fact, lots of people would say that the war will continue as long as the Prime Minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, needs it to continue for his own personal ends. So basically, if we talk about safety of Jews, the safety of these kidnapped, who everybody would like to see released, of course, because most of them have done no wrong, I mean, all of them have done no wrong, they've been kidnapped, is not looking imminent. So to talk about Israel being a safe place for the Jews because it has a very strong army and because it is a major manufacturer of armaments and security systems is absolute and utter nonsense and a lie, in fact.
Thanks for that answer, Ronit. You've devoted your professional and personal life to anti-racist scholarship and activism. And from memory, you left Israel in 1967. I'm curious to know what events may have led or served as a catalyst for that decision.
As I said, I was brought up in a Zionist manner. Everything in my life, my parents, my schooling, the youth movement, the popular songs, the plays, the radio, the television, everything was in fact aimed to create out of us loyal Zionist subjects. However, then the 67 war came. It was sold to us as if we were attacked by Egypt and by Syria. And in fact, it was sold to many of us as a second Holocaust. And many of us were very anxious about this. the war was won very easily. I remember roaming the streets of Jerusalem with some friends who were not enlisted in the army for various reasons, and really walking under a barrage of bullets and being quite frightened. But the war was won within 6 days, as you all know. And I was kind of watching what was happening. We were quite euphoric. We went immediately to Eastern Jerusalem to see the sites that we were prevented from seeing beforehand. But we were sitting in a bar some 3 weeks after the war, and I was sitting with a group of radical left-wingers who have been talking about colonization, about apartheid, and about racism long before everybody's talking about it now. No, they didn't use the term colonialism, but colonialism was mentioned. And I said to them, you know, kind of, there's still shooting in the north. It's not quite finished. What's going on? And they sat with me for about an hour and told me the story about Zionist imperialism, about colonialism, about apartheid, about us being the aggressors. And suddenly, the penny dropped. And when the penny drops, it can't go back. Once you know, you can't unsee. Once you see, you can't unsee. And I understood the nature, the deeply racist nature of Zionism, which constructed the Jews as superior race and all others as inferior races. I understood colonialism. I understood imperialism. And from then on, my path was clear. I've been an activist since shortly after the '67 war, to various degrees and to various intensities, but I have really saw the light very early on. For that, I must thank my comrades in that group, which was called Matzpen. Doesn't exist anymore. It numbered something like 30 or 40 people, but it was labeled and represented a very scary group to the Israeli establishment.
Wow.
Yes. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to change tacks a little bit now. We spoke recently about faith, about spirituality, about Jewish identity, and you know, you mentioned that when you were living in Ireland, you were a member of a community of activist Jews, but it was mostly political. But that's changed since coming here to Aboriginal land. Would you care to talk us through how that's changed and what role Jewish identity currently plays in your life?
Yes, I've always been a proud Jew. I mean, when I was teaching a new course at university, I always started, I'm a Jew, I'm an Israeli Jew, I'm going to teach you as a Jew, so don't tell me afterwards I'm teaching you as a Jew. But the point is that our political activism as a group called Jews for Palestine Ireland was part of the Ireland Solidarity, Ireland-Palestine Solidarity campaign, and we decided not to work on our Jewish identity, but to work as part of the movement, and we understood perfectly well that being Jewish was useful to the movement. I came here and I joined a group called Tzedek. Tzedek in Hebrew means justice, and it's a group of people, many of whom are in fact still observant Jews, still Orthodox, and we're very much more spiritual and more interested in our Jewish identity. And as such, we join the general solidarity campaign. We go to all the rallies and we do various things, but we also do other things. For instance, to give you an example, outside of Albanese's office, there's a 24/7 vigil of mostly Palestinian people who sit out there protesting the genocide, protesting the inaction of the Australian government. And we have, one of the things we did, we offered them a Shabbat, a Friday night dinner, one evening, on Friday night, and we said prayers, we bless the wine, we bless the bread, as one does on Friday nights, and we worked there as Jews who are proud of our Judaism, and who are offering not only political support, but also spiritual, being Jewish in our position, we're all anti-Zionist Jews, but we also work on other social justice issues, including indigenous justice issues and some other social justice issues. So actually it's been, for me, at my advanced age, quite an eye-opener to be able to be more spiritual. And in fact, my daughter, who is in her early 50s, is part of that group as well. And it's actually wonderful to work together with her. One of our signs that we are very happy to carry at the rallies is a self-loving Jew for a free Palestine. Because when Jews criticize Israel, they're called self-hating Jews. But we in fact are very much self-loving Jews, very much proud of our Jewish heritage, Jewish history, without being religious. I mean, we are somehow traditional, but we're not really observant in this respect. But we feel our connection to our Jewish spirituality, and that's been a great gift that this group, Tzedek, has gifted me.
Thank you so much, Ronit. If everyone could please give Ronit a round of applause for sharing her experiences. Now, don't be nervous, Michelle. We're all really lucky to have you here and to speak your truth. Michelle, I know that being Jewish was and is a very big part of your identity. I'm wondering if you can paint a picture of what that looked like growing up here in Australia.
Well, thanks for that question. My mum was not born Jewish, but converted to Judaism through a 7-year process. And I was very close with her family, very close, the non-Jewish side of my family. But I can genuinely say that the stories and the atmosphere and the, what's called in Yiddish, Yiddishkeit, that sense of Jewish identity and home and warmth and so on, was very, very formative from my father's parents, from my paternal grandparents. And as a big part of that was the history of the Holocaust, because my grandmother was born in probably what was then, we think she was born in Russia in those days, and so her family had experienced pogroms, and she married my grandfather in Poland, and gradually they became aware that they just didn't want to stick around for the rising violence that was sweeping across Eastern Europe. And they moved and moved and moved and ended up in Strasbourg. And so when Hitler was elected and was rising, this very small branch of our family decided to emigrate. Nobody else would join them. So they ended up in this little flat in Bondi, pretty much watching as the rest of their entire extended family was murdered in the Holocaust. And their flat was like a little hub for the Jewish community. And pretty much every adult whom I knew in those years of mine, those formative years growing up, everyone had the blue number on their arm. Everyone I knew, they didn't speak about it directly, but I guess I must have been told by my parents or my grandparents. They had all lost fathers, mothers, siblings, wives, husbands, children. That had been their history, and this was a huge influence on my understanding of what it meant to be Jewish. And I think that was what really made me very susceptible to the Zionist narrative that was just so prevalent in my synagogue. It was seamless. There was no difference between the two. You were Jewish, and therefore you celebrated Israeli Independence Day, for example. And the idea of this kind of, strong, upright, warrior Jew as a very, very, an opposite to the persecuted, suffering, exterminated Jew, was a very, very strong part of my sense of identity as a Jew.
I was wondering if you would mind telling us a little bit about your first trip to Israel and why you ended up moving there and what that experience was like for you.
Well, I first went to Israel with my parents when I finished my HSC, and I fell in love with the place. Completely and utterly fell in love. We lived on the kibbutz. My father had gone as a volunteer in 1973. He had gone to work on the kibbutz, and so we went back there. And as a young socialist, it appeared to be a dream to me. I worked in the fields, I worked with the sheep, I got up early, went to bed early. I didn't experience any of the anti-Semitism that I had experienced at my school, from teachers, from students. I had a snapped nose to show for my troubles, being a Jew. So it was an incredibly seductive experience, and to sit on a bus and just look around and everybody's Jewish. Nobody's going to say anything horrible to me. That was a very, very big thing. And I made the decision that I would go back and live there, that I would, as they call it, make aliyah, which means go up. So if you're a Jew and you migrate to Israel, you ascend to Israel. Conversely, if you leave, you fall. Right? So that tells you something. I was absolutely captivated by that, and by the sense of history. And even though I can say that even though I went there, it must have been 76 and 80 when 1976 first, and then I probably moved back in about 1979 or 80, I still didn't have any idea of an occupation. None. It was possible to go there as a young Jew and to catch public transport, to go here, to go there. We went to Gaza, we went to Al-Khalil, we went to all of these places. I had absolutely no idea. So I loved being in the kibbutz. And I look back now with shame and horror at the stories that I was told, that I kind of lapped up in this sort of innocence of my kibbutz family telling me about, their acts of daring do during, 1948. And I did ask questions, because I went roving over the hills, and, I found a beautiful old olive press, and I asked about that. And I was just told that was ancient. That was from the Arabs in the ancient times. It was only many years later, when my eyes were well and truly opened, that I did the research and found that my kibbutz was, founded on the ruins of a Palestinian village, and that the people who I lived with and worked with and loved and whatever were genocidal ethnic cleansers. So it's a very, very profound sense of betrayal of my youthful innocence and my Jewishness. So Zionism is not. It's a betrayal. It sucks in young Jews, young idealistic Jews, and uses them for its purposes, and then spits us out.
But you credit 2014 as the moment when you officially ceased to identify as a Zionist, and you looked for other Jewish organisations or communities who may have been going through a similar awakening or had already come to that conclusion. What happened in 2014 for you?
Well, I had lived for years in rural New South Wales and raised my children, and I had left that area and I was back in Sydney, and I had a television set in 2014, and as you will know, that was Operation Protective Edge, and it was 51 days where my children watched their mother implode. I had what I guess was a nervous breakdown. I paced the floor. I could not tear myself away. I couldn't eat. I could barely sleep as I watched this unhinged level of savagery that I could not align with anything that I had ever been taught about what it meant to be Jewish and what Jewish history was and what Jewish ethics were. And at the end of that period, I set myself a task of finding other Jews. And it was a terribly, terribly difficult thing because Israel has made a very, very successful enterprise out of conflating Judaism and Zionism. So when you lose your Zionism, who are you as a Jew? Who was I? I didn't know anymore, you know. I didn't know what all those stories of survival from, you know, my grandparents' family, what had that meant? Was it for this that I had survived, that my family had survived? Was it for this to become this vile, shocking perpetrator of violence? And I think it was a Google search. I found a group called Jews Against the Occupation. And we are now Jews Against the Occupation 48 because we recognise that Palestine is not occupied only from the 67 borders, but that Palestine from the river to the sea is occupied. It's occupied by a colonial state. And we completely refute any claims to ownership by that colonial state. And Jews Against the Occupation has been essential for me to be able to reclaim for myself what it means to be a Jew in a history of radical action, in a history of social justice, solidarity, all sorts of wonderful things that I was never taught about because I was always taught that a Jew was a victim. And the only way, as Renit said, the only way that you would not be a victim was to be a perpetrator. But in fact, Jews Against the Occupation and SEDEC has given me that access to an honourable and profoundly fulfilling way of being a Jew again.
Thank you so much, Michelle Birkin. If you could please give you a big round of applause. It's very powerful. Thank you, Michelle. Peter, you're the son of two Holocaust survivors who were secular Jews and not especially political. What did Jewish life look like for you, and what role, if any, did Zionism have to play in it?
Well, the first thing that occurs to me to say is that I have a different story from Veronica and Michelle. I grew up in a Jewish family. I mean, all our friends were Jewish. As Daz has said, my parents were both Holocaust survivors. My mother and grandmother survived Auschwitz. Most of my family perished there. And most of our community were post-war migrants, many of them, most of them were survivors. So I grew up in an ordinary post-war Jewish family, and all my friends until the university were Jews. The difference between us is that I was never, or am not now, proud of being a Jew in the way that you've described it. I've written a bit about this. And I'm particularly thinking of an essay by George Orwell against nationalism. I think being proud of the accident of one's identity is a mistake. I think it leads to all of the terrible things that we can think of in history where nationalism has led to terrible crimes. And I think, it's sort of a joke I make, what have I got to be proud of? Einstein or Spinoza? Or what did I do to be proud of what other Jews have done? You should be proud of what you've done. So there's a long story, and I won't give you the full-blown lecture on why I think it's a mistake to be proud. We're supposed to be proud of being Australian, but I don't get credit for Don Bradman, or, you know, whatever else one might be proud of. So this is a long story, but it's a sentiment that I think is important, because I think we're encouraged to feel this irrational identification with our group, and therefore to feel hostility towards other groups. You all know this. We all follow our football team, and we hate the people on the other side. This is a bad precedent for world affairs. I know this is contrary to what most people think, but it's, I think, an interesting point. That certainly in my biography, I long ago abandoned any sense, and in fact I might say the question of, I never went through this crisis of identity for a number of reasons. My parents were the only Jews that I knew that didn't have what every Jew has on their door, is a little thing called the mezuzah. That's where the little prayer is on every door. And I had a bar mitzvah, as every good Jewish boy does, which is when you're 13, you have, I think the Catholics call it a confirmation, it's similar. And I won't give you the whole full story, but I broke away from my Jewish friends when I got to the university, and I started meeting all of these other nice people that weren't my friends, and I committed the ultimate sin. I married a non-Jewish girl. That's a Catholic girl. And actually, you know, you may not know, but you guys will know, for Jews this is the biggest sin. For many religions it's the biggest sin. You know, the Jews actually sit in mourning. It's called sitting Shiva, which is like having a mourning as if your child has died. This tells you what belonging and nationalism and patriotism means. How belonging to a group is very deep. I could tell you many stories about how deep it is. But so that was part of my history. And it's summed up in a lovely slogan. You know, Groucho Marx was Jewish. He said, I wouldn't belong to any club that would have me as a member. Well, that sums up my sense of my identity. And it's significant for all of us here. You can see we're all wearing a Palestinian scarf. That's very significant. We are, as one of you said, regarded as self-hating Jews. This is a way of making an absurd distinction. I mean, in a certain sense, you'll understand, I'm embracing my Jewishness, but not in the same way, perhaps. In this paradoxical Groucho Marx sense, I felt I have to assert my Jewishness. My credentials are really good, but it's in order to identify with the Palestinians and stand up against what is the requirement of good Jews to be loyal. So, I mean, that's the short kind of version of where I see myself fitting in based on my parents' history. Before I think about it, I still got the floor, let me just mention one other thing. One of the big differences for me was my parents, for whatever reason, didn't send me, like all the other Jewish kids, to the summer camps. They're all Zionist summer camps. I didn't go to, I don't know why I didn't go, but I didn't get the indoctrination, the Zionist indoctrination that they all got. Beitar, Habonim, I don't even know what they mean. These are some sort of, you know, Beitar I know, it was the Jabotinsky radical political movement. And so my parents were not political, which saved me from becoming indoctrinated. They just left me alone. They were secular, educated, and weren't so caught up in their, although my father could read Hebrew, we had the annual Passover service at my uncle's place, and it's worth saying that my first indication that I didn't belong was, you know, the youngest boy in the family. I don't know how many of you know how the Jewish Passover service works every year. The youngest boy has to read a little prayer which starts off in English translation. Why is this night different from all other nights? Well, I couldn't read the Hebrew, so my cousin had to read it. So this was already a sign that I am somehow an outsider. And it was uncomfortable, but in retrospect, it was very healthy to feel an outsider. And just while I'm mentioning it, the guys here will know, there's actually a passage I discovered much later on in the liturgy of that evening's prayer, which distinguishes the four sons. They're nodding because they know. None of you will know this unless you're Jewish. The four sons, there's this one, the good one, and this one, and that one, and then there's the son who doesn't belong. That was me.
Thank you, Peter. So the second question is kind of in keeping with this idea of tribal identity. And in 1994, the Palestinian-American academic and intellectual Edward Said wrote, "No one is above the organic ties that bind the individual to family, community, and of course, nationality." I feel that this is a particularly pertinent quote, given the conversation we had earlier today where you mentioned that since October, you've been rather surprised by the behaviours of some of your Jewish friends.
Yes, look, interestingly, you mentioned Saeed. I have to say, I was at Columbia University in New York, and I didn't know at that time, this was in the early 70s, Edward Said was on the floor below where I was, he was in the English department and I was in the philosophy department. His name is still on the letterbox at Columbia University as a sort of a gesture of reverence and to honour him. I didn't know about him when I was in graduate school. He became famous later. But that quote is from one of his lectures, if I'm not mistaken, called Representations of something or other. He gave it as the Wreath Lectures. Interestingly, the point I made earlier, I often make it and then quote Edward Said about the fact that we all care, to go back to the earlier remarks, we all cherish our culture. We love the foods of our tradition and all of the music and all of those things. That's not the same as being a nationalist. That's why Edward Said says, look, I love my mother's Hungarian cooking and the Hungarian music, and they're very deep emotional connections. But
Sorry, I'm just going to cut you off. Edward Said didn't say that. You said
No,
that.
I'm saying that. I'm saying that. But Edward Said's point is that although we all have this deep emotional connection with our culture, he's the one that says we have to universalise and see our common humanity. That's the key. That's what I was trying to say before. And it's an accident of my history that somehow I found it easier than others because I wasn't indoctrinated. Edward Said is very important in that way. So yes, thank you for that.
Ahead of this forum, we received an email from the local rabbi, and he was concerned that this event would spur on anti-Semitism in the Newcastle community. So, Peter, I guess I'll ask you this question. As a Jew and as a professor of philosophy, how would you respond to those concerns?
Do you want to be more specific? Which concerns specifically about anti-Semitism?
Yeah, that's right. He was concerned that the nature of this event would actually increase anti-Semitic behaviour within Newcastle.
Dear, where do I begin? Look, the first thing is to say, obviously, you can imagine now that you know some of my background, I'm going to be the first to stand up and protest and object and resist any kind of anti-Semitism. But I have to say, and this is directed at most of you, I think, are not Jewish, you are being intimidated and blackmailed into silencing your criticism of Israel because it is constantly being conflated with Jewishness. I feel very strongly about this because this is a long history. The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations many years ago, Abba Eban, famously said to a Jewish audience, whenever Israel is criticized, you have to respond to it by saying it's anti-Semitism. And he said this when Gentiles, he meant, non-Jews. It works because everybody understands the Holocaust. Everybody understands how awful that tragedy was. But speaking as somebody who knows about the Holocaust, I grew up with my parents' stories. My parents spoke frequently about it. I feel strongly to kind of encourage you not to be intimidated and browbeaten into being silenced about the crimes of the state of Israel, which they pretend are in the name of Jews. We hear evidence that, now, by the way, the rabbi in his letter, because I read it, he said, we're unrepresentative. We shouldn't speak on behalf. He's right. We're not representative. We're not speaking for Jews. We're speaking to the Jews. We're telling them that we're a minority who are offended by and object to the fact that they are trying to assimilate, identify, as the Jewish state does. It operates under the Star of David. It calls itself the state that represents all Jews around the world. In 2018, they passed the most scandalous kind of like constitutional law called the nation-state law. There were already 50-odd, what do you call it, legislation, features of the law, the, what do you call it, NGO Adala in Haifa, lists the number of laws which were already on the books which discriminate against the non-Jewish population, the 20% that are Palestinians. In 2018, they passed the nation-state law declaring for the world that Israel is the state of the Jewish people alone. Well, I was going to swear. Screw that. The point is that they are now making it very clear that this is a supremacist, racist state, and they want to browbeat you into being fearful of criticising the state because then you'll be attacked as an anti-Semite. Don't permit that to silence you when the state of Israel is committing these atrocities on such a large scale, unprecedented scale. So anti-Semitism is a very bad story.
And I was just going to add to that, actually. I mean, you're the son of Holocaust survivors. Michelle, you grew up in Bondi, where you basically spent every Saturday evening in an apartment where everyone had the blue tattoos on their arms. I mean, you have so many stories about this sort of thing as well. I mean, anti-Semitism is very real and it's incredibly harmful, and it's out there, and we all need to make sure that we call it out. And I just wanted to, I guess, talk about another aspect which is often overlooked of the Jewish tradition, which is the radical Jewish tradition, a tradition that actually takes a stand for human rights. I mean, a lot of us who don't identify as Jewish, we learnt about, maybe here, particularly in our cultural context, one of the first genocides we learnt about was the Jewish Holocaust. And I know that as someone who then sort of pursued a career in media, specifically because I personally cared immensely about human rights, you know, a lot of that came from what I learned that happened, you know, leading up to the Second World War and the Nazi regime. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that tradition that exists within the Jewish community.
First of all, the Holocaust was not the first genocide. Second, the Holocaust or the Nazi genocide was not only against Jews. Many other people were eliminated by the Nazis, including Roma people, including gay people, including political prisoners and Slavic people. In fact, to take the Holocaust out of history and make it a unique event is a mistake, because indigenous people have been murdered and annihilated by their colonizers long before the Holocaust, including the German elimination of the Herero and Nama people in Africa. So basically, to make the Holocaust the cornerstone of our understanding what racism is and what Jew hatred is a total mistake. Anti-Semitism existed before the Nazi Holocaust, but also there were genocides committed by the Hebrews in the land now called Palestine against various other tribes, which is now being cited. So it's very important not to exceptionalize the Holocaust as the worst, and not to exceptionalize anti-Semitism as the worst and different sort of racism. Racism is racism. And in fact, if you look at the world today, the worst sort of racism is Islamophobia. And we have to remember that. Now, we need to fight anti-Semitism through solidarity with other negatively racialized people, not through shouting, we are being victimized here. And, you know, people talk about Israel's right to defend itself. Now, an occupying power, a colonizing power, has no right to defend itself against the people it colonizes. And this is important to remember. So all of these things need to be remembered when we exceptionalize the Holocaust. And I really applaud Jonathan Glazer for his speech, because speaking it at the Oscar ceremony is very, very helpful. We must put things, we must compare. And if you look at Zygmunt Bauman's book about modernity and the Holocaust, he shows, in fact, that the Holocaust was a consequence of European modernity, of bureaucracy and so on. But he says we must compare. We must not exceptionalize and must not say the Holocaust was the worst ever, because colonized people and indigenous people know damn well that there were other horrible events of annihilation of groups. Okay, so I think we need to put that into perspective.
Absolutely, thanks so much, Ronit. And the final question is for both you, Ronit, and Peter, as scholars. It concerns the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, also known as the IHRA, which has been adopted by several governments and institutions around the world. The University of Melbourne, I think, being the first academic institution here on Aboriginal land to do so. So just wondering whether you'd mind explaining what your chief concerns are with this definition and what impact you believe it might have on scholarship.
Well, I personally think it's a very flawed definition. I mean, there's no need for a new definition of anti-Semitism. Antisemitism, as I said, is a form of racism, but what is wrong with the IHRA is not the actual 38-word definition of antisemitism, but the 11 examples that accompany it. And in these 11 examples, criticism of the state of Israel is in fact named as a form of anti-Semitic racism. And this is not true. We have to separate, as Peter said, we have to separate between the Jewish people and the state of Israel. It's just interesting to mention a very dear friend of mine, Professor Nadera Shalhub Kevorkian, who is a Palestinian professor of criminology and social work in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, was suspended from her job just the day before yesterday because she dared name what's happening in Gaza genocide. She dared cast doubts as to whether what Hamas did included rapes of Jewish women. This is something which has been alleged, not yet substantiated. And she also said that the abuse of children and women by the Israelis, Palestinian children and women, is in fact amounts to sexual abuse. And for that, Nadera, who is a world-famous scholar in her area, has been suspended from her job. So this is what actually definitions such as that cause. They cause the dismissal of people who dare to criticize the state of Israel.
Thanks, Ronnie. If I could add to that, I agree entirely with what you've said. It's important to understand that those 6 or 7 examples are actually unexceptionable criticisms of Israel, that it's a racist state. Well, it just is. So that's one thing. The other thing that I have to add, 2 things. Firstly, it's been enormously widely adopted. I wrote a report, in fact, for Tanya Plibersek. I met with her and wrote a report about the state of this until a little while ago, but I have to say something about that. It had no effect on the Labour Party. In fact, so much so that our Prime Minister, in a public online interview, endorsed the IHRA definition to his shame, and also said that the boycott movement we might talk about is anti-Semitic, which is just bullshit. And the point about the IHRA thing, to add, a group of about 500, I think, or 200, I don't know how many hundred, Jewish scholars of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust provided an alternative definition called the JDA, the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. Now, Ronit, I think, said you shouldn't need a definition. In fact, to the credit of some of the universities, they said we've got very powerful anti-discrimination, which encompasses, I mean, you don't have to have one about Hindus and Muslims and Maoris and I don't know what. You don't need a specific one for every group. The JDA understands that and separated out the nature of anti-Semitism in the light of this. Let me see if I can articulate quickly what the problem and the virtue of this is. They understood that racism has to be understood, as Ron had said rightly, as a general phenomenon of hatred. So the definition captures that. The trouble is that it would serve a powerful weapon in this worldwide plague of weaponizing anti-Semitism. And although it shouldn't be needed, I think it serves a valuable role. If somebody wants to wave the flag to show that they're opposed to anti-Semitism, this would be a very valuable alternative, which is not problematic in the way that the IHRA was. Let me say one of the things that's been a difficulty for me and a group of us who wrote to all universities. The Palestinian community have not adopted and seen the JDA as the powerful and valuable instrument that I think it is. There are various criticisms of it which I don't agree with, and I'm just mentioning this because I still think that if people want to show their credentials, the Prime Minister, for example, it's no good to tell him to just drop the IHRA. If he wants to show how brave he is to stand up against anti-Semitism, it looks like you should give him something. That's why these 200 scholars came up with a definition which I think is actually a good one. So this is a problematic concern here, but I'm just endorsing Ronit's remarks that anti-Semitism should be seen as part of the broader racism which we all rightly oppose, and we should stand up against it, despite the attempts of our Prime Minister and, in fact, the United States and universities. They've all embraced this because they want to show how brave they are to stand up against racism. It's a very bad mistake because it gives a free pass to Israel in ways that we shouldn't permit.
And Ronit has something else to add.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one thing. The chair of the meeting suggested this meeting is not about us, it's about you, what you can do. And I think one thing you could all do is adopt the boycott, divestment and sanction campaign. You could all do it in various ways.
And I'll add a quick word to that too. The boycott movement has been accused of being anti-Semitic. They make the most disgraceful comparison. You may know that if you see pictures of the Nazi Germany, the Jewish shops had painted on it the Star of David, and there was a German phrase, if you speak German, kauft nicht bei Juden, means don't buy from Jews. So now these awful people who are running this are trying to assimilate a human rights movement for justice, and the targets of the BDS movement are not Jewish. That tells you what a bunch of, I don't know what rude word to use here. I'm struggling to be polite. They don't deserve it. So imagine assimilating a human rights movement. The principles of BDS are international law and human rights, and they dare to compare it to the Nazis. And one other remark. I just read a very good book about the history of this. You know, most Germans didn't buy it. There's this prejudice that the Germans were all anti-Semitic. It's not true. A lot of Germans went into those shops regardless of the rule that they should stay away.
Thank you all for so generously sharing your experiences and your perspectives with us. I think it's now time for me to hand over to Rob so he can facilitate the audience Q&A, but just before I do, just wanted to take a moment to thank Edwin Montgomery for all their work and support, Gillian and Kent Shaw for their generosity with accommodation, Audrey Rare and Tanaka Zeo for their extraordinary support and hospitality, and archival and transdisciplinary researcher Eloise Chandler for her help with the introduction. And of course I'd like to thank you too, the audience, for taking the plunge, leaving any preconceived ideas behind and joining us for what has been an incredibly formative discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Daz. Yeah, we'd love to have your questions. Can I just ask you, please, to actually ask a question? That would be very helpful. I'm going to give two microphones, and I'll ask the panel to share a microphone. And if you'd like to ask a question, please put up your hand, and a microphone will come to you. We might start with you, sir.
Press the button.
You are welcome to ask a question to the panel or to Daz. Please come and join us, Daz.
Hi. Robert, your experience of when the penny dropped. How can we make the penny drop for the whole of Israel?
A good question.
Well, read, find out. Oh, how can Israel drop the penny?
This is about them, not
I'm not
us.
very helpful, I must say. I'm saying, at the moment, it's not just the government. Unfortunately, if you read the Hebrew paper, beneath every article there are appalling comments. If you read social media, there are appalling comments. If anybody writes anything in criticism of Israel, people say, oh, we haven't killed enough. We should kill more. We should bite them all. There's no innocent people in Gaza, and so on and so forth. It really is a worse time. We all agree, as activists, it's never been so bad in Palestine as it is at the moment. I would love to retain some degree of hope, and the hope is the solidarity shown with the Palestinians throughout the world by civil societies. That's the only hope. But I am not very hopeful about Israel dropping the penny.
Look, thank you, panel, for coming. I'm really grateful to hear your voices, to hear Jewish voices. It's just wonderful to hear. Thank you. Do you think in Australia many Jews are turning the tide? Do you think the tide is turning, or do you think many Jews are still following the Zionist line? What do you think the attitude is amongst the Jewish community at the moment?
It's a good question to ask, and it follows Ronit's point, if I may. Let me give it from a personal point of view. I still mix in the Jewish community, and I try to argue with them. Something surprised me this time, which I didn't expect. I've been involved in this kind of activism for very many years and arguing with the Jewish community. The thing that surprised me was I've got close friends that sort of are more or less on the same page, but not quite. I thought that when Israel really behaves so badly, they'll say, this is too far. They'll balk and they've crossed the red line. The thing that surprised me was that the opposite happened. The Jews that were critical of Israel in small ways, now they've reverted to a tribal loyalty, the nationalism I talked about before. They're reflexive closing ranks. This is shocking, and I think it's a widespread phenomenon. And it tells us how difficult the problem is we're dealing with. So in Australia, my evidence is pretty reliable. The Jewish community, for one reason, I follow the Jewish press. They're not paying attention to what happened since October 7. I'm sorry to be rude about this. I'm always embarrassed in a non-Jewish audience to say that they are wallowing in the tragedy of October 7, which was real enough, and what happened. They are not paying attention to what happened afterwards. This is a human feature, or before, the history before. They're not aware of it, but this is much worse now. I mean, if you watch, in fact, it was said by John Lyons, the wonderful journalist at the Adelaide Writers' Festival, because he's been there and watches the television, the Israeli press are not showing the immense atrocity that is the current situation in Gaza. This is shocking. And we're not too different in our wars in the past, perhaps. But so that's an answer to your question.
But I mean, in the Australian context, amongst Australian Jews.
I'm talking about Australia now. I'm talking about the Australian Jewish community. They're not paying attention.
My question is, could you explain to us what this boycott movement is? Person on my right, person on my left, and myself, we didn't know much about that. First question. And do you think there's any possibility of a peaceful solution between the Palestinians and Israelis who have common humanity?
The boycott, the BDS movement, was begun as a social movement among the Palestinians about 2005. Thank you. It has three principles. If I can remember them now, I should know this. One is the return, end the occupation, the return of the refugees, and equal rights of the Palestinians inside it. And it's a movement of the Palestinian social movement of the Palestinian people, supported now around the world. The comparison is made with the boycott of South Africa, but there are some important differences. The worldwide support for human rights is motivated in the same way. As I mentioned before, and I'll repeat it, it's not directed at Jewish organizations. The lead targets of the BDS movement have been international, multinational corporations. It's not directed at individuals, it's directed at organizations. So Veolia, Caterpillar, Hewlett-Packard, any organisation that is profiting from the occupation in the West Bank, or in Israel probably, are appropriate targets. There's a central body, an international body, that is the kind of oversight of the BDS movement around the world. And it's a human rights movement for international law, and we should all support it. And the reason is that there are a few other things available to us to change things. The question before about how can we change things, Ronnie is quite right. It's not going to happen from inside Israel. South Africa wouldn't have ended apartheid if it wasn't for the fact that the world pressure, including boycotts, started to force it to change. People aren't going to give up their privileges for no reason. So the boycott movement is perhaps the only thing we've got available to us.
Two more things. It's a non-violent movement, first of all. And secondly, the divestment part is important. Because if you look at your super funds, for instance, some of them are invested with Israeli banks. You should do a little research and find out. There are some products one should not buy, like Israeli dates, for instance, particularly now in Ramadan. However, they are insidiously ingrained. Do you know, for instance, that the Australian Army just last week had paid $917 million in buying Israeli arms systems from the Israeli company Elbit. All these things, they have to be looked at carefully, and then your politicians should be pressurized.
There's a question over here.
Good evening. Thank you very much to everybody on stage for your time and sharing your sentiments and your knowledge. I would like to ask, why do you think that the world is, or our Western media, our part of the world, is so focused on the problem in the Middle East and kind of disregards or ignores the 140 or something other armed conflicts that happen in the world?
God, that's a tough question. Go for it.
Hi everybody, I used to work in media full time, so I think I'll answer this question. I think that there's a few reasons. First of all, I think that this has become such a mythologized conflict. You know, it is so deeply written in, you know, the psyches and the psyches of the nation states that were the dominant imperialist powers at the time that the State of Israel was formed. So for people who sit here and think that actually this has nothing to do with us here on Aboriginal land, think again, because we are actually quite instrumental to what is happening, and we are actually implicit in what is happening. Not only are we sending arms, not only are we sort of making choices in sort of, you know, the rules-based order that we have available to us in this reality that actually then put a stop to a ceasefire, for example, or actually put a stop to the continuation of Yanawa aid, which sadly and regrettably has not been reinstated yet by Albanese. You know, we're actually making decisions here in Australia that have really very real consequences on the ground for the people who are currently in famine, for the people who have no access to any clean water. So I actually think that it's important that Western media, so-called, and then you're right to say it, and institutional media here does pay attention. I would like them to do a much better job of it, to be honest. I've been quite disgusted by the level of journalism since what happened last year in October, and obviously for the many decades before that. And I think that really it's time for us to start writing letters and demanding a much higher standard of reporting.
I was going to add something to that too. I think if I can reverse the way you described it, it's the opposite. It's not that they're paying a lot of attention. Until the Palestinians broke out on October 7th and did something terrible to the Israelis, then the media went crazy. I don't know how many of you knew that for 17 years Gaza has been under the most brutal blockade. It's a crime in international law. When I was there in, it must have been, I don't know, 2000 no, later, I was there in 2012 actually, I think. They told us not to drink the water, not to let the water touch our lips when we're having a shower. The water is undrinkable in Gaza. The unemployment rate, kids with kidney disease, the place was described as going to be unlivable from 2020. You have no idea how bad that place has been, the suffering of the Gazan people under this cruel blockade. For 17 years, the media weren't showing you that. So they showed you when something terrible happened. And finally, you know, there's this jailbreak, these people, desperate people, do something. and then the media pays attention. So we have to be aware that actually it's not like there's all this attention to the crime. And by the way, let me give you another point about this. How many people in the media have seen anything about what's happening in the West Bank? The West Bank is being ignored. They've killed, I don't know how many hundred people there when the attention has been now on Gaza. The occupation and the brutality and the rampaging around of the IDF all over the West Bank is much worse than before because nobody's paying attention to it. So the media are culpable in this very selective way of what they pay attention to. We have to be very aware of that.
Last question.
The question? Yeah, the question about why should Australians be interested, particularly in this conflict, is that another aspect of it, aside from what other people have said, is that we are deeply complicit in it. Despite the fact that Penny Wong says, we haven't exported XYZ to Israel in the last 5 years and so on, all you've got to do is go on the DFAT website and you find that information, that parts and fabricated metals that are manufactured here in Australia are instrumental in raining death and destruction on Palestinians in Gaza and in creating the havoc that is currently being wrought upon Palestinians in the West Bank. Also, not only do we sell things that enable the brutalisation of Palestinians, but we also buy intelligence systems from and actual parts as well. I don't know exactly what kind, that I'm not so sure of, but we buy things from Israel which our security sort of apparatus uses in surveillance and in the increased militarisation of police in this country. So the relationship between the two countries is very, very strong, and we are complicit in what they're doing. And I was just going to add that we also, our intelligence from Pine Gap is instrumental in enabling the Israeli genocide forces to behave with to gain the intelligence that they have to do what they're doing in Gaza and in the West Bank. So the reason Australians should be concerned is because we are complicit and because we are also on the receiving end of Israel's exporting of its occupation.
Thank you. I just... how's that? Is it going? No. How's that? Ah, we're in business. Okay. Thank you all. My thoughts are that Israel, the state of Israel, is sowing the seeds of its own destruction. And I think the current terrible conflict which is going on will come to some sort of end. Does the panel see any sort of viable future solution to the Israeli Middle East conflict?
Well, first of all, it's not a conflict. It's colonization. Secondly, there are various solutions floating around. To me, the best solution will be one new political entity between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, which will be equal, where it will be one person, one vote, and the people who live there are the citizens and the owners of that political entity. Other people believe in a two-state solution. It's very small territory. Palestine and Israel, as Daz has informed me, is less than half the size of Tasmania. It's a tiny place, 2 states. I wonder that at the moment there are 14 to 15 million people living there. I don't quite see the two-state situation. I think that train has left the station, as Gideon Levy says. But I think we have to sit down, talk, and I believe our job as anti-Zionist Jews is to let the Palestinian lead to the solution. And we should support them in discussing. They have various opinions, discussing and arriving at the best new political entity between the river and the sea.
I just want to add something on that slogan that Ronick mentioned. You'll be aware perhaps here and around the world at every rally, the Palestinians and their supporters like us will say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. You have to also understand how the Jewish community, the Zionist lobby, have now attacked this. Again, typically in the light of what I've said before, by accusing them of, thank you. They accuse this as being an anti-Semitic, annihilationist claim that we want to get rid of, the Palestinians want to get rid of all the Jews and murder them all. This is bullshit, and it's a sinister piece of propaganda where everybody who's Palestinian, now at rallies when I've spoken, I make it explicit and then the audience cheers, because what it means is equality, human rights, international law for the Jews and the Palestinians from the river to the sea. That's what it means, and we all know it means that, and now we have to say it publicly so that the acclaim from the audience tells the Zionist lobby that they can't accuse people saying that of being annihilationist or exterminationist, which is what they want to say, again, to sinister, in a sinister way to condemn them. Michelle reminded me, you have to know, and you may not know, that the Israeli Likud party, of which is the Prime Minister Netanyahu's party, they have had on their charter explicitly that there will be no Palestinian state from the river to the sea. They currently, of course, occupy the whole place, so there's this most cynical, hypocritical argument. They actually have occupied from the river to the sea already. And when the people are protesting, they just want human rights and equality, they accuse them of being annihilationist and exterminationist. You shouldn't tolerate this and don't put up with it.
Sorry, we've run out of time. We might be able to get some time at the end. On behalf of the Newcastle Institute, I firstly wanted to thank Jazz Chandler, who has given so much time and effort, sorry if you're emotional about this, to put this together so that we can have some diverse discussion and respectful discussion about this issue that we're all interested in, but for which we get so little coverage about the diversity of the ideas and the views and the challenges. So Daz, thank you. Ronnie, Michelle and Peter, thank you for coming from Sydney. I understand that it has been difficult for you to present some of your ideas in Sydney, and you felt that this may have been a safer place. Thank you for your time in Newcastle. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but we really appreciate that you've given up your time to come and have this respectful discussion. I'd like to thank, not the microphone, I'd like to thank you for coming, for being such a respectful and considerate audience. We were worried because we've had some comments that have been mentioned and others that we haven't mentioned, but we really appreciate that you've stuck to our idea of respectful, rational discussion about diverse ideas. So thank you for coming and joining with us in this respectful discussion today. Dialogue on shore in a civil society is much more effective in the long term than war, bombs, polarisation or any of those things, and we've seen that tonight. Thank you. Can I just also say that we have streamed this live on Facebook, and we've had quite a lot of views going on. It will be up on the Newcastle Institute website tomorrow if anyone wants to watch it again. We've had a slight hiccup today about our next event, so we won't be announcing that tonight. You can understand that our efforts are being focused on today, so we'll be announcing that. But we can announce that in May, we're having Dr. Ken Henry, who many of you will know was the Secretary of Treasury between 2010 and I'm not quite sure the final date, but he served under Howard Rudd Gillard governments, and he's talking about tax reform and the need for tax reform in Australia for the future. So that's our next event. Look out for the April event, and we'll get over this hiccup that we've had today. So thank you again for coming. I'd also want to let you know that there's an event, and I know some of you have mentioned it tonight. There's an event tomorrow night at 5:30 at Newcastle City Hall, and I know some are going. It's about Conversations for Palestine tomorrow night at 5:30. They've had a similar problem to us in that we had to close down the registrations, as you know, tonight because we couldn't really take any more, and I think they're facing a similar situation soon. So if you want to go register for the event tomorrow night, I think this event and that event tomorrow show that we are interested in the dialogue about this issue that concerns us all. So thank you and safe travels home.
Nice to meet you.